Andreas Vesalius was born Andreas van Wessel to Andreas van Wessel and Isabel Crabbe on 31st of December 1514 in Brussels. Andreas Vesalius was a Flemish anatomist, a physician, and author of one of the most influential books on human anatomy, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the structure of human body. Vesalius is often referred to as the founder of modern human anatomy. He was a professor at the University of Padua and later became imperial physician at the court of Emperor Charles V. Andreas Vesalius is a Latinized form of the English Flemish Andreas van Wessel, a common practice among European scholars at his time. His grandfather, Edvard van Wessel, was the royal physician of Emperor Maximilian, while his father, Andreas van Wessel, went on to serve as an apothecary to Maximilian and later a valet de chambre to his successor Charles V. Andreas encouraged his son to continue in the family tradition and enrolled him in the Brethren of the Common Life in Brussels to learn Greek and Latin according to the standards of the era. In 1528, Vesalius entered the University of Leuven. Taking arts, but when his father was appointed as the valet de chambre in 1532, he decided to pursue a career in medicine at the University of Paris, where he moved in 1533. Here he studied the theories of Galen under the auspices of Jacques Dubois and Jean Fernot. It was during this time that he developed his interest in anatomy and was often found examining bones at the Cemetery of the Innocents. Vesalius was forced to leave Paris in 1536 due to the opening of hostilities between the Holy Roman Empire and France and returned to Leuven. He remained at Leuven only briefly before leaving after a dispute with his professor. After settling briefly in Venice in 1536, he moved to the University of Padua to study for his doctorate, which he received in 1537. On graduation, he was immediately offered the chair of surgery and anatomy at Padua. Previously, these topics had been taught primarily from reading classic texts and mainly Galen, followed by an animal dissection by a barber surgeon whose work was directed by the lecturer. No attempt was made to actually check Galen's claims. These were considered absolute. Vesalius, on the other hand, carried out dissection as the primary teaching tool, handling the work actually by himself, while his students clustered around the table. Hands-on direct observation was considered the only reliable source, a huge break with medieval practice. In 1539, he published an updated version of Galen's anatomical handbook, Institutiones Anatomica. A few weeks later, he published an abridged edition for students, Andrea Vesali Surum de Humani Corporis Fabrica Librorum Epidemi, and dedicated it to Philip II of Spain, son of the emperor. The Fabrica emphasized the priority of dissection and what has come to be called the anatomical view of the body, seeing human internal functioning as an essentially corporeal structure filled with organs arranged in three-dimensional space. This was in stark contrast to many of the anatomical models used previously, which had strong Galenic and Aristotelian elements as well as an element of astrology. Although modern anatomical texts have been published by Mondino and Berenger, much of their work was clouded by their reverence for Galen and Arabian doctrines. In 1538, he also published a letter on venesection or bloodletting. This is a popular treatment for almost any illness, but there was some debate about where to take blood from. The classical Greek procedure, advocated by Galen, was to let blood from a site near the location of the illness. However, the Muslim and medieval practice was to draw a smaller amount of blood from a distant location. Vesalius's pamphlet supported Galen's view and supported his arguments through anatomical diagrams. In 1539, a Paduan judge became interested in Vesalius's work and made bodies of executed criminals available for dissection. He soon built up a wealth of detailed anatomical diagrams, the first accurate set to be produced. Many of these were produced by commissioned artists and were therefore of much better quality than those previously. In 1541, Vesalius uncovered the fact that all of Galen's research had been based upon animal anatomy rather than the human. Since dissection had been banned in ancient Rome, Galen had dissected Barbary apes instead, and argued that they would be automatically similar to humans. As a result, he published a correction of Galen's Opera Omnia and began writing his own anatomical text. However, some people still chose to follow Galen and resented Vesalius for calling attention to glaring mistakes. Vesalius, undeterred, went on to stir up more controversy, this time disproving not just Galen but also Mondino de Luisi and even Aristotle. All three had made assumptions about the functions and structure of the heart that were clearly wrong. Other famous examples of Vesalius disproving Galen in particular was the discovery that the lower jaw was not only one bone, not two. It is proof that blood did not pass through the internal septum. In 1543, Vesalius conducted a public dissection of the body of Jacob Carr von Gebwiller. He assembled the bones and finally donated the skeleton to the University of Basel. This preparation is Vesalius' only well-preserved skeletal preparation today and is also the world's oldest anatomical preparation. It is still displayed at the Anatomical Museum of the University of Basel. Later that year, Vesalius asked Johannes Operinus to help publish the 7th volume on the fabric of the human body, a groundbreaking work of human anatomy he dedicated to Charles V. Over the next 11 years, Vesalius traveled with the court, treating injuries from battle or tournaments, performing pace and pastorments, and writing private letters addressing specific medical questions. In 1551, Charles V commissioned an inquiry in Salamanca to investigate the religious implications of his methods. Vesalius' work was cleared by the board, but the task continued. 4 years later, one of his main detractors published an article that claimed that the human body itself had changed since Galen had studied it. After the abdication of Emperor Charles V, he continued at court in great favor with his son Philip II, who rewarded him with a pension for life and by being made a Count Palatine. And in 1555, he published a revised edition of De Corporis. In 1564, Vesalius went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. After struggling for many days with the adverse winds in the Ionian Sea, he was wrecked on the island of Zakynthos. Here he soon died in such debt that a benefactor kindly paid for his funeral. At the time of his death, he was scarcely 50 years of age. Vesalius had a number of scientific contributions, including the skeletal system. Vesalius believed that the skeletal system to be the framework of the human body. It was in this opening chapter or book of De Fabrica that Vesalius made several of his strongest claims against Galen's theories and writings which he had put in his anatomy books. In Galen's observation of the ape, he had discovered that the sternum consisted of 7 parts which he assumed held true for humans. Vesalius discovered that the human sternum only consisted of 3 parts. He also disproved the common belief that men had 1 rib fewer than men, and noted that the fibula... He also disproved that the common belief that men had 1 rib fewer than women, and noted that the fibula and tibia bones of the leg were indeed larger than the humerus bone of the arm, and unlike Galen's original findings. He also discovered the muscular system. Vesalius' most impressive contribution to the study of the muscular system may be the illustrations that accompany the text in De Fabrica, which would become known as the muscle man. He describes the source and position of each muscle of the body, as well as providing information on their respective operations. Vesalius' work on the vascular and circulatory systems was his greatest contribution to the complex in modern medicine. In his dissections of the heart, Vesalius became convinced that Galen's claims of a porous intravascular spectrum was false. This fact was previously described by Michael Servetus, fellow of Vesalius, but never reached the public, for it was written down in manuscript of Paris in 1546, and just published later in his Christini Restituto, a heroic book of the Inquisition. Vesalius published in the 2nd edition that the septum was indeed waterproof, discovering the mitral valve to explain the blood flow. Vesalius believed that the cardiac systole is as synchronous with the arterial pulse. Vesalius believed that the cardiac systole is as synchronous with the arterial pulse. He not only verified Estienne's findings on the valves of the hepatic veins, but he described the azygos, and he discovered the canal which passes into the fetus between the umbilical vein and the vena cava. He also took note of the inferior menisteric and hemorrhoid veins. Vesalius defined a nerve as the mode of transmitting sensation and motion, and thus refuted contemporaries' claims that ligaments, tendons, and aperoneus were 3 types of nerve units. He believed that the nerves do not originate from the heart, but that the nerves stem from the brain. Upon studying the optic nerve, Vesalius came to the conclusion that nerves were not hollow. Although Vesalius accepted Galen's inaccurate claim that the liver was the locale of blood production, he would not accept the vena cava stems from the liver. He also disproved Galen's belief that the liver consisted of 5 lobes and stated that it is instead 2 lobes. In De Fabrica, he corrected an earlier claim that he made in Tabulae about the right kidney being set higher than the left. Vesalius claimed that the kidneys were not a filter device for the urine to pass through, but rather than the kidneys to serve to filter blood as well, and that the excrement then traveled through the ureters to the bladder. He corrected the views of the structure of the pylorus. He gave the first good account of the mediastinum and pleura. The efforts put forth by Vesalius in his ethic to provide the most accurate form of the human body helped lead to modern medicine. Also, by overthrowing the Galenic tradition and relying on his own observations, Vesalius created a new scientific method. Through his attention to detail, he was able to provide clear descriptions and unprecedented anatomical drawings that set a new standard for future medical books. Fun fact, during the 20th century, the American artist Jacob Lawrence created his Vesalius suite based on the anatomical drawings of Andreas Vesalius.